How many times have you turned on the television or hopped online, only to be met with breaking news about an impending crisis that feels like it came out of nowhere? A hurricane is bearing down on your coastline. A cyber attack has crippled major utilities. The economy is teetering on the edge of a massive recession. And yet, as you scramble for supplies or scroll through conflicting media reports, you can't help but wonder, why didn't anyone warn me sooner? The reality is that the government often knows more about these threats than it lets on, but chooses to share only a fraction of that information with you, and usually far too late. Agencies spend countless hours running simulations, gathering data, and preparing contingency plans behind closed doors. Still, the public remains largely in the dark until it's already time to batten down the hatches. Instead of giving you the full picture from the start, officials tend to spoon-feed updates in a way that maintains calm and minimizes potential panic, even if that means you miss the window to take decisive action. If you're tuning in right now, you're probably the kind of person who wants real talk, not sugarcoating, not false reassurance, but a genuine understanding of what's going on so you can protect yourself and your family. If that's you, then do me a quick favor. Share this video and subscribe if you haven't already. It's a small gesture on your part, but it can make a big difference in spreading the word about personal preparedness. Because the more people understand these hidden truths, the stronger and safer our communities can become when real disaster strikes. In a moment, we'll dive into the core reasons why it so often feels like you're on your own in a crisis. From there, we'll unpack the most significant threats the government tracks but rarely warns you about until the last possible second. Then we'll examine how, when emergencies do happen, the official response often centers on managing citizens rather than addressing the disaster head-on. We'll get into why FEMA's help isn't always what it's cracked up to be, and, most importantly, reveal the only practical solution you have at your disposal: self-sufficiency. Yes, it's a buzzword, but once you see how chaotic and delayed official aid can be, you'll understand that you have to start taking matters into your own hands. Stick around, because by the time we wrap up, you'll know exactly how to break away from the wait-and-see mentality that gets so many people in trouble when disaster arrives. That sense of empowerment, of truly being prepared to handle the unexpected, may well be your most valuable asset in an increasingly uncertain world. One of the biggest misconceptions we have as citizens is believing that when the going gets tough, someone in a high office will step in to coordinate a perfect rescue. It's an understandable assumption. After all, we elect leaders and fund agencies to protect the public interest. But time and time again in large-scale disasters, the pattern is clear. Ordinary people are left scrambling for basic necessities while government officials hold press conferences that often come off as vague or overly optimistic. Eventually, if the situation grows dire, you might see more urgent warnings. Yet by that point, store shelves are usually empty, traffic is at a standstill, and it feels like pure chaos on the ground. When you look at any major crisis, hurricanes, pandemics, even moments of social unrest, you tend to see the same story daily briefings that tiptoe around the real severity of the problem. Whether officials are downplaying a coming storm or being non-committal about how bad a virus outbreak might get, the initial public-facing statements rarely match the level of concern behind the scenes. A lot of it comes down to controlling public perception. If they declare a major emergency too soon, the fear is that millions of people might flee cities, buy out essential supplies, or withdraw money from banks, actions that, in their view, destabilize the economy and heighten disorder. So they hold back, hoping to manage the situation with half measures until the last second. But for you, that tactic often means losing the best advantage you have: time. Imagine having just a few extra days to shore up your home, purchase supplies, or evacuate if you're in harm's way. Those days might be the difference between a calm, collected response and having to fight the crowds in a mass panic. However, from an official standpoint, if announcing a disaster too early causes a spike in social anxiety or a wave of overbuying, it's considered risky. When they err on the side of holding back, it's you who pays the price in the end. Another angle is the bureaucratic structure itself. There's a chain of command that usually involves local authorities, state-level agencies, and federal agencies before something is proclaimed to the general public. Each entity might have its own political priorities or be under pressure to downplay or emphasize specific details. By the time a warning filters through all those layers, it can be stripped of the urgency it initially had, or arrive so late that the public has to scramble. It's frustrating, and it leads to those moments where you see your local grocery store swarmed by anxious shoppers emptying shelves of water, bread, and canned goods, all within hours. And then there's the reality of where you stand in the hierarchy. Continuity of government plans exist primarily to keep leadership functioning. Entire bunkers, specialized transportation, and exclusive stockpiles are set aside for those with titles and security clearances. The average citizen is expected to wait for emergency broadcasts or official statements, which often come at a point when avoiding the brunt of the disaster is no longer possible. This dynamic underscores a sobering message. If you're not among the political or military elite with access to special resources, you have to rely on the same delayed warnings and undersupplied shelters as everyone else. Yes, in many cases, local and federal teams work tirelessly in the aftermath to rescue people, restore power, and distribute food and water, but that's after the damage is done. The focus is on recovery, not prevention. And during that tense window right before a crisis peaks, the priority often remains on preventing public panic, even if that means you're missing critical information about the severity of the threat heading your way. It's a tough pill to swallow, but once you recognize that, in the first crucial hours of an emergency, you're essentially on your own, you can start planning for that reality. Waiting around, hoping for an official green light to start preparing, might put you right in the crosshairs of a fast-moving disaster. The sooner you make peace with the idea that official channels might not give you enough time or intel to protect yourself thoroughly, the more likely you are to take practical steps for your own self-preservation. Let's move forward and examine the kinds of threats that governmental bodies watch closely. Ones that might radically impact your life, even though they rarely speak plainly about them until it's crunch time. Let's say you've heard occasional rumors about cyber attacks, or maybe you've seen a short news clip about the fragility of our aging power grids. But how real is the danger? If you dig even a little beneath the surface, you'll find that government agencies are actively monitoring these vulnerabilities, running simulations, and discussing scenarios so grave they sound like the plot of a disaster film. The big difference is that this isn't fiction. It's a legitimate concern that could knock out your power, water, or fuel supply for days or weeks. It doesn't take a doomsday scenario for our modern infrastructure to collapse. A sophisticated hacker could breach the electrical grid, bring down banking systems, or disrupt crucial communication networks. Federal reports, often partially classified, acknowledge that in a large-scale cyber attack, we could face immediate shortages of food and medication because distribution relies so heavily on digital systems. Credit card networks fail, ATMs go down, and businesses grind to a halt. Yet the public announcements you hear might just say something along the lines of, "We're experiencing technical difficulties. Please be patient." By the time it's confirmed to be a malicious attack, you're already in the dark, both literally and figuratively. Then there's the subject of economic collapse. Economists in government departments keep a close eye on everything from corporate debt to housing markets and consumer spending habits. They run numbers to see what would happen if unemployment spikes or if a major financial institution collapses. The truth is, many officials have a sense that the system is precarious long before we see stock market plunges or a wave of bankruptcies in mainstream headlines. But there's a deliberate hesitancy to sound the alarm because they worry that warning the public might trigger the very panic that accelerates the collapse. So they hold press conferences with carefully worded language about contractions or market corrections, reassuring folks that everything will stabilize soon. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, they scramble to prevent a full-blown meltdown. Pandemics are another area where the government usually has a head start on intelligence, yet remains tight-lipped until it's unavoidable. Disease specialists and researchers often detect new pathogens early on, or they closely follow outbreaks in remote parts of the world. Governments compile data on infection rates and potential mortality before the public knows the pathogen even exists. They do this in secrecy because they want to confirm details, gauge potential global impact, and coordinate an official line of messaging. By the time the media starts flashing warnings, the virus might already be crossing borders, establishing clusters in multiple cities, and entering a phase where containing it is far more difficult. That lost time can be critical for hospitals stocking up on equipment, for families needing protective gear, and for businesses deciding whether to send employees home. You might wonder, if the government really knows all this, why keep it under wraps? Part of the reason is what they see as public order. If people knew just how close we might be to a large-scale crisis, some would flood the banks to withdraw their money, others would hoard supplies, and still others might even consider leaving the country. Officials see that kind of mass reaction as worse than the threat itself in some cases, so they drip-feed information and hope to manage the panic. But what does that mean for you? It means you're not even in the position to act preemptively when you otherwise could. Maybe you would have liked a week's notice to move your elderly parents out of a high-risk flood zone, or to buy the generator you'd been eyeing, or even to purchase N95 masks in bulk before everyone else realized they needed them. What we're dealing with is a fragile system that can't absorb a sudden jolt of panic without risking major social and economic ripples. To keep that ripple effect controlled, officials typically opt for secrecy or soft warnings. The result is that you only discover what's really going on when it's practically knocking down your door. Of course, you can't live your entire life on red alert, but you can prepare in ways that mitigate these last-minute surprises. And that's why it's so critical to see the bigger picture. The government has its playbook, but it's a playbook that doesn't always factor in your immediate best interests. A crucial part of dealing with these hidden threats is knowing how you'll be managed, rather than protected, once an official emergency is declared. Because make no mistake, that's often the next step. Controlling the movement of people, controlling information flow, and rationing resources in the name of public safety. Let's shine a light on how that plays out so you can be aware and ready to make better decisions when the alarms finally sound. In the event of a large-scale crisis, the government's first instinct is often to keep the public calm and orderly, sometimes at the expense of being fully transparent. From their perspective, the possibility of widespread unrest looms larger than the disaster itself. That's why you'll see travel restrictions, curfews, or even outright lockdowns under the banner of public safety. Certainly there's a rationale. If a hurricane is coming or if a pandemic is raging, restricting movement can slow the spread of disease or protect people from immediate harm. But in other situations, it might simply be about preventing large groups from leaving or entering certain areas, controlling who can access certain resources, and making sure that any dissent is quickly quashed. Resource control is a big piece of the puzzle. Once officials declare a state of emergency, they can ration food, water, fuel, and medical supplies. Again, the stated goal is fairness, but it often translates into long lines where families end up receiving identical provisions even if their needs vary. It's not unusual to see supplies run out rapidly, leaving many people empty-handed after waiting hours under the hot sun or in pouring rain. Furthermore, you may not even be allowed to leave your region if the roads are blocked by checkpoints. This can lead to high-tension standoffs, panic buying, or even black market activity as people try to obtain enough resources to sustain themselves. Information control is another form of management. Have you noticed how in some crises, the news from official channels feels repetitive and overly optimistic compared to what you see on social media or hear through your local networks? Part of that is strategic communication. Authorities know that if they paint too bleak a picture, they risk losing public confidence. So they'll often focus on positive angles, like an evacuated area that avoided the worst of the storm, to discourage people from making impulsive moves. Meanwhile, if you or your neighbors are in a life-threatening spot and you rely solely on these filtered announcements, you might stick around longer than you should. Or if you want to voice your frustration, you might find your posts on social media flagged as misinformation or get overshadowed by the official narrative. Those who do try to operate outside the official system, such as local volunteers who gather supplies or independent media outlets that show unfiltered coverage, may discover that they're at odds with emergency regulations. It's not always malicious. Sometimes officials worry that independent efforts will interfere with professional rescue teams or cause confusion. But the bottom line is, if the government has decided that a particular narrative or plan of action is what's best for the public, they don't appreciate alternative viewpoints. So if you're reliant on your own network or your own resources, you could find yourself inadvertently clashing with local authorities. In more extreme cases, martial law can be declared. It's a drastic measure that gives authorities expanded powers, allowing them to suspend certain constitutional rights. Curfews become mandatory, and the military can be used to enforce rules instead of the local police. This tool is reserved for when social order is on the verge of collapsing, but it has happened in various forms around the world. And if you think it can't happen here, just remember that governments will pull every lever they have if they think it's necessary. Under martial law, your ability to move freely, gather in groups, or even share information can be severely restricted. All this can sound grim, and it is. But understanding how you'll be managed is crucial if you want to make your own informed choices. Maybe you decide to evacuate earlier to avoid roadblocks. Perhaps you stockpile certain essentials so you're not stuck in government ration lines. Or you set up alternative communication channels so you're not relying solely on official statements that might downplay reality. Being aware of these tactics puts you ahead of the curve because you're not blindsided when they start handing down orders that limit your freedom of movement. Or when you notice the official story doesn't match what's happening in your neighborhood. Now you might think, well, at least we have FEMA for relief, right? And yes, theoretically, agencies like these do provide assistance. But as we'll soon explore, what they offer and how effectively they can offer it might be a far cry from the quick, comprehensive aid you're hoping for. If you find yourself waiting on the government to ride in like the cavalry with supplies and perfect organization, you might be sorely disappointed when reality hits. Let's talk about that next. FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is often portrayed as the safety net that automatically steps in when disaster strikes. Turn on the news after any major hurricane, wildfire, or flood, and you'll see footage of personnel setting up tents or handing out supplies. In theory, it sounds great, but in practice, the agency's ability to respond swiftly and effectively is hit or miss at best, sometimes downright abysmal. Look no further than the fiasco following Hurricane Helene for a stark example. Despite early forecasts clearly indicating the storm's path, FEMA's response was slow, disorganized, and hampered by bureaucratic missteps that left entire communities stranded without basic essentials. Part of the problem is the sheer scale of modern catastrophes. When a major hurricane barrels through multiple states or an earthquake devastates a highly populated region, juggling the logistics of food, water, medical supplies, and power generation becomes a nightmare. They could have warehouses full of rations, but that doesn't mean they'll arrive in time, especially when roads are destroyed, power lines are down, and local officials are overwhelmed. After Hurricane Helene, for instance, entire neighborhoods went unassisted for days, even though the agency publicly claimed it had resources at the ready. That disconnect fueled frustration and distrust among residents who felt abandoned. On top of that, the chain of command can be murky. They typically have to coordinate with local and state governments, creating a bureaucratic pipeline that easily clogs. Supplies may literally sit at a distribution center while different agencies bicker over authorization or paperwork. Meanwhile, you could be stuck sleeping in your car, your home gone, waiting on official word about when or if you'll see help. The talking heads might tell the cameras that assistance is on the way. But as we've seen in disaster after disaster, especially during the Helene debacle, no one seems to know exactly when aid will actually reach the people who need it most. Then there's the assumption that a single, uniform approach works for everyone. Even if they do manage to deliver pallets of meals, ready-to-eat MREs, and bottled water, that doesn't help new parents who need infant formula or seniors who require life-sustaining medications. Hurricane Helene was a glaring case in point. Families with specific medical needs were left out in the cold, literally and figuratively, because the agency's standardized distribution plan didn't account for unique household requirements. When shelters are set up, it can feel like a last resort, cramped, chaotic, and lacking any semblance of privacy. Families might have to travel hundreds of miles just to reach the closest available facility. That not only uproots their lives, but leaves their homes and possessions unguarded, sparking fears of looting or vandalism. The conditions in these shelters can also be dismal. We're talking about inadequate air conditioning, limited sanitation, and so few beds that people end up sleeping on the floor for days on end. Little wonder some folks choose to hunker down on their own rather than put faith in a system that may fail them anyway. This isn't a dismissal of the dedicated men and women on the ground who genuinely do their best under horrible circumstances. However, their track record, especially in large-scale crises like Hurricane Helene, proves that good intentions don't always translate into rapid, effective relief. Between red tape, leadership miscalculations, and outdated logistics, the agency frequently becomes bogged down exactly when time is of the essence. So if you're tempted to rely solely on any federal agency for immediate, personalized relief, you might be setting yourself up for disappointment. A sobering but crucial realization is that the responsibility for your well-being ultimately rests with you. Once you grasp that the cavalry, if it comes at all, might show up late and under-equipped, you start seeing the wisdom in preparing for a disaster on your own terms. Because at the end of the day, waiting for the government to rescue you can feel like waiting for a train that might never arrive. That's why the best plan of action is to pivot towards self-sufficiency. When you know their limitations firsthand, you're more inclined to build up a personal reserve of food, water, medications, and supplies. The mindset shift from trusting in sweeping federal promises to trusting your own hands can be the deciding factor in how well you endure whatever crisis comes next. Now let's explore what it really means to stand on your own feet when chaos strikes. People sometimes cringe when they hear the term self-sufficiency. It conjures images of extreme survivalists holed up in a bunker. But the real essence of self-sufficiency is far more approachable and, frankly, necessary for anyone living in a world where the next major crisis could be just around the corner. It simply means recognizing that in those first few days or even weeks of a disaster, you might have no one else to rely on but yourself. One core aspect of self-sufficiency is stocking up before a crisis happens. This doesn't mean panic buying entire pallets of canned goods whenever you see a scary news report. Rather, it's about gradually building a sensible reserve of the items you already use and need. That reserve typically includes enough food and water to last your household at least a couple of weeks, along with key items such as extra batteries, flashlights, a portable radio, first aid supplies, and any critical medications. The aim is to avoid the frantic last-minute rush when everyone else suddenly floods the stores. If you've been there before, you know how quickly essentials vanish from the shelves. By preparing quietly and consistently, you ensure that a short-term disruption doesn't immediately cripple your daily life. Next, consider how you'll manage without public utilities. Think about power outages that last beyond a few hours, especially during scorching summers or freezing winters. Do you have a way to keep your home at a livable temperature? A small generator, solar-powered chargers, or even a wood stove can be lifesavers, depending on your situation. The same goes for water. If local treatment plants go offline, you might lose access to safe tap water. Having a stash of bottled water is a good start, but also learning how to purify water from other sources, like rainwater or a nearby creek, can make an enormous difference. Simple tools like a water filter or purification tablets can keep you from dehydrating or risking illness. Communication is another pillar of self-sufficiency. When cell towers go down or become overloaded, you need alternatives. Some people turn to ham radios or walkie-talkies, especially if they live in rural areas prone to storms. Knowing a few frequencies or channels where local groups check in can help you stay informed. You don't want to rely solely on official broadcasts that might be delayed or censored. Connecting with neighbors can form a local network of aid and information, especially if government relief efforts are slow or mismanaged. Don't forget the value of practical skills either. If someone gets a nasty cut and emergency services can't reach you, do you know how to clean and bandage the wound? If your generator stops working, can you troubleshoot it? Skills like first aid, basic carpentry, and even simpler tasks like operating a fire extinguisher might never make headlines, but they become paramount in an emergency. Imagine losing power for a week after a severe storm and realizing you don't know how to safely run your portable heater. That's the kind of situation self-sufficiency is meant to circumvent. You develop the competence to solve your own problems, rather than relying on an overwhelmed system to help. A vital but often overlooked facet is mental resilience. Crises can drag on and feel relentless, testing your patience and emotional endurance. Crises can drag on and feel relentless, testing your patience and emotional endurance. When you're prepared, not just physically, but also mentally, you cope better with adversity. You're less likely to feel blindsided or helpless, which in turn makes you more confident and decisive. This ripple effect can also uplift others, such as family members or neighbors who might initially feel overwhelmed. None of this is about living off the grid full-time, unless that's your choice. It's about equipping yourself so that when disaster strikes and local infrastructure buckles, you're not standing in a mile-long line for bottled water, or desperately refreshing your phone for an official announcement that never comes. Instead, you'll already have water, food, and a plan. You'll be calm in the midst of the storm, because you've run these scenarios in your mind and prepared accordingly. With each passing year, disasters, whether natural or human-made, seem to grow in intensity and frequency. The government's reactive model, combined with its tendency to manage public behavior rather than aggressively addressing every looming threat, means you can't wait around for that official signal. Self-sufficiency is the antidote. By cultivating this mindset and assembling the necessary supplies and skills, you effectively insulate yourself from the worst-case scenario. By cultivating this mindset and assembling the necessary supplies and skills, you effectively insulate yourself from the worst-case scenario. You won't become immune to crises, but you'll be far less vulnerable and less reliant on a system that may or may not come through in time. That's the kind of security and peace of mind you can't put a price tag on. Let's close things out by tying all these threads together into a single, clear call to action. By now, you've seen that the system you thought would protect you, from elected officials to large agencies like FEMA, often isn't equipped to offer you the timely, transparent support you'd hope for. In crisis situations, governments commonly prioritize controlling the masses and preventing chaos over giving you a comprehensive warning. Critical details are filtered or delayed, leaving you to scramble at the last minute, pushing your way through crowded stores or flooding highways in a desperate attempt to get out of harm's path. What's the solution? It starts with a simple yet transformative choice: refusing to rely solely on official channels for your survival. That doesn't mean ignoring public service announcements altogether, but it does mean taking personal ownership of your fate. Stock up on essential items today, gradually, systematically, so you're not blindsided tomorrow. Learn basic self-reliance skills that could save a life or keep your household functioning when services fail. Connect with neighbors, build informal networks, and share knowledge. The more prepared your community is, the less likely you'll all be left twisting in the wind when disaster inevitably strikes. If you found this discussion even a bit eye-opening, help spread the message. Share this video with friends, neighbors, and family members who might still be on the fence about the need for personal preparedness. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so we can keep talking about how to fortify our lives against the unknown challenges ahead. You never know who might stumble upon these conversations at just the right time and be spurred into action. Disasters come in many forms: storms, viruses, blackouts, financial downturns. But they all reveal the same underlying truth. You can't count on last-minute help from massive institutions that have to juggle political agendas, limited resources, and public relations. Once you accept that, it becomes much easier to take small, manageable steps toward self-sufficiency. Over time, those steps add up, giving you a buffer against panic and a sense of calm in moments when everyone else is losing their heads. So, let's stop waiting for the next ominous press conference. Let's stop assuming that because something isn't on the 6 o'clock news, it's not worth worrying about. Take an honest look at your own household, your pantry, your water supply, your emergency plan, and start filling the gaps. Because when the day comes that the lights go out or the evacuation order drops, you'll be glad you took action. And, in the end, that preparedness is what might just see you through the storm, while others are still checking their phones for an official warning that may never arrive.